Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We are discussing the Trickster. Whether you know him as Loki, Coyote, or even Jesse James, the Trickster has had an impact on the lore of the Ozarks. We will get back to that in a minute, but first we want to remind you that the Dark Ozarks podcast is now available on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, or about any other podcast platform. So how did the Trickster affect the legends of the Ozarks?
From the infamous folk hero Outlaws to cryptid tales, Coyote, or even Lil Abner, the Trickster has been at home in the Ozarks for hundreds of years. You have to look at the tall tales, the Native American lore, as well as the myths that were brought with European settlers.
We will return to the question of how the Trickster is hiding in plain sight in the Ozarks. But first, we want to invite you to like, follow, and subscribe to Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, as well as your favorite podcast platform. We also invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook. On the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, click subscribe, have your login information ready, and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for only $4.99 per month.
Your $4.99 per month subscription allows you to come with us on paranormal investigations, deep dive research, and topics too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers will be entered in a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first-run copy of the book Dark Ozarks: The Spooklight. Subscribe today to be entered in the drawing.
And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
We encourage you to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online on Facebook and at the website alwaysbuyingbooks.com for all your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention, the building is haunted. Tell Bob and Elise that we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and great food in a historical building with a noir past. And yes, their building is also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
Oh, good stuff. Good stuff. I have several books from Always Buying Books, actually right here in front of me. It's pretty normal at this point. And I want some English ale.
Yes, me too. We have to get back up there.
We do. And exciting. I would encourage people to check out that subscription option, mainly because there's a lot of off-the-cuff things that we can put on there that we really can't put elsewhere. So the subscription option on Facebook, and one of them is on the ground videos from investigations.
Yes, and there's going to be several of those coming up before too long.
It is, and our well, any season is investigation season for us, but we are picking up a number of locations that we have been invited to, having the opportunity to check out. Some of them are quite active in terms of paranormal activity, and it's neat to go into those spaces and just see what happens.
Exactly. So stay tuned, watch all of our media outlets and get those details.
Absolutely.
The Trickster.
Oh, Trickster is fascinating, and we are really surrounded by the Trickster archetype, oftentimes without realizing it, and sometimes we really are drawn to this archetype in many ways, without realizing precisely why.
That's true, and that holds true not only just in lore and myth, but in our history as well, which people don't always realize is that a lot of the anti-hero folk heroes really fit into that category, and I may engender some askance looks from viewers and listeners, but one prominent example out of the Ozarks would be Jesse James.
And I think that's really interesting. Now, on a more mundane level, James certainly is seen as the anti-hero following the war. He is, in essence, continuing the war. There's a natural transgressiveness that is taking place here, but it's also one that structures from certainly from a Southern perspective, or a Southern leaning perspective, a Confederate perspective, but also from a uniquely Missourian perspective, that a grounding in activity, a groundedness in the response, in the sense that had Jesse James been doing these actions under sanction from the Confederate Army during the war, he would not necessarily be recognized as an outlaw.
That's true. But, and even beyond that, when you look at the characteristics of the Trickster, Jesse James employed a lot of those factors. You can tick off a checklist almost.
Which one? Yeah, I was going to ask, which ones really jump out to you?
Well, using disguise. The Trickster is usually a shapeshifter of some sort, or uses disguises to hoodwink and fool his opponents. And of course, during robberies, they would cover their faces. And so, you know, on a technical sense, definitely that falls into that category. Also, the Trickster tends to almost invariably be male. Some over the top behavior, but there's usually either some very base behavior, or you know, in this case, thievery or outlaw behavior, but very clever. And certainly the James employed a lot of clever techniques, and not only to accomplish their robberies, but to garner the support of the average people, who basically hid them so that they were not caught. And so, and it's part of the reason that there's such that parallel between Jesse James in pop culture and Robin Hood, who also falls under the Trickster motif.
He does, and it would be fair, I believe, to say it's one of the reasons that the legends are so enduring.
Yes, we are drawn to the archetype, and have been for thousands of years.
And as I was doing research this afternoon, and we get around to Robin Hood. Robin Hood is an interesting character. Well, the thing that really is fascinating to me is that we all know everything about Robin Hood, but we actually know nothing practically about Robin Hood.
True.
And you know, my claim to fame is that everything I learned about Robin Hood, I learned from watching the Disney animated film. But I don't think that it is any big surprise that in the animated film, Robin Hood is portrayed by a fox.
Yes, and which is also another attribute of the Trickster. Oftentimes is that transformation between being a human and an animal.
Yes, I found that really really interesting. We have told, and we, I mean, as humanity has told trickster stories from what we can tell, pretty much as long as there have ever been humans telling stories.
Pretty much.
And an enduring aspect of the archetype with this storytelling is animals. The first of all, that the trickster, and we'll get more into this a little bit later in the episode, but just in a short synopsis, the trickster is a god and an animal who acts like a human being.
Yes. In the
lore.
In the original lore, yes. And but certainly through history there have been people who certainly employ the attributes of the trickster.
Yes. And the thing that I just thought of as I was working on stuff this afternoon was how interesting it was, and probably inadvertent, the idea of those archetypes welling up unbidden, that the animated Robin Hood classic by Disney is just that. It's animals performing in a human world.
Yes.
And Robin Hood as the trickster is portrayed by a fox, not, first of all, not that far removed from a coyote, and second of all, the fox has often appeared as a trickster motif in European lore. So interesting combinations there. But then taking it a step further, the idea that individuals embody these characteristics, and that's where we come to the outlaws.
Exactly. And in that sense, it's hard not to see the James brothers fitting into that archetype, which I think is part of the appeal.
I agree. I very much agree with that.
And I think one of the more legendary stories about them really illustrates that point. And that's helping the widow save her farm.
Yes. Yes.
They basically, they are the outlaws. But they outwit the opponent, which in this case is the banker, who's about to foreclose on this poor widow shortly after the Civil War. The gang has come to the farm, asked to spend the night. She feeds them, although they realize pretty quickly that she doesn't have much, but she shares what she has with them. And then at some point, one of the brothers, and it's usually kind of hinted that it's Jesse, notices that she's crying and asks what's the matter, and she says that the banker is coming that day or in the morning to foreclose, and she doesn't have the money needed to keep the farm and a roof over her head and the children's head. And so they ask how much she owes, and it's usually, in the story, it's usually $500, which was a huge amount at the time. And they take the money out of their wallet, give it to her, and tell her when the banker comes to give him the money and make sure she gets a receipt, which is them being clever to outwit the opponent. And then, of course, the banker comes, is surprised, has to honor her payment, gives her the receipt, and as he's riding back to town, of course, they stop him, rob him, and get their money back.
Yes. Something that is, well, I guess first of all, obviously this is a part of the larger legend of Jesse James. Mm-hmm. How confident are we that this did or did not happen in real life.
I mean, there's, as far as I know, it's never been pinned down as to a specific widow, but the tale is actually told in various versions as happening in different places
Okay.
throughout, usually somewhere in Missouri. So it may or may not have. We simply don't know.
Yeah.
But
It's one of those stories that, first of all, it is fun to imagine.
yes,
The everyday person can enjoy imagining that it happened. There's certainly an enormous amount of good-natured trickster archetype in this story. Because of that, and this is one of the things that I think often gets overlooked when you're dealing with archetypes, is that the truth of the archetype, the truth of the legend, is just as important as the historical documentation.
exactly. The story itself is the important thing. Now, the flip side of that is, if they had been presented with that scenario, do I think that they would have done exactly that? Yes, and relished in it.
Mm-hmm. I tend to agree. And there's also something to me that is fascinating about this process. And we see it with Robin Hood. We see it with Jesse James. So just tying those directly together with a lot of years and multiple centuries in between.
Mm-hmm.
But in coming back to the motif of the banker in the 1870s in rural Missouri, that this was there is a transgressive or subversive quality to this, because the railroad, the bank, these are and consequently the law.
Yeah.
These authoritarian structures. What is the purpose of the authoritarian structure? To provide safety, to provide well-being, to provide infrastructure, to if you were to ask in any of these iterations, that they are there to bring modernity or help the people or build civilization, these types of things. And then you focus down from the macro and the PR campaign,
Mm-hmm.
and you focus down to the micro, which is the individual. And suddenly we have these situations. In the case of post-war Missouri, we had a lot of these situations, and it wasn't just Missouri, where on the micro, the opposite was happening. We had an enormous amount of hardship being taking place as a result of some of these processes, some of these policies, and an enormous amount. We see something very similar during the Great Depression, where individuals who, for example, may have worked incredibly hard, may have done everything quote unquote right, done their best in terms of interaction with the American dream, etc. And suddenly, what's going to happen? You're a widow. You're going to have a bureaucrat foreclose on your house, and you and your children don't know where they're going to sleep tomorrow night.
Very true. And there are several figures from the Great Depression and Prohibition era that really fit into this archetype as well. John Dillinger comes to mind, who would rob banks, but give silver dollars out to children on the street. And you could, in some ways you could almost say Pretty Boy Floyd and Bonnie and Clyde fit into that motif a little bit, or at least would have more so during that time period as being seen as fooling or getting back at the banks who were foreclosing on everyone's farms and so forth.
Yes. And I think that there is also something of note in terms of how the authoritarian structure responds to a trickster figure in this position.
True.
And its retribution is typically swift.
If they're able to catch the trickster, yes.
Yeah.
And that's always the question.
And I think that whether it's fully spoken or not, the fear is that the subversiveness of the trickster, because the trickster archetype or the trickster god is there to upset the social order.
Yes.
He's there to stir the pot. He is there to turn things upside down. And I think on a very base level, a very base foundation, the proprietors and the authority of the social order respond very quickly and from a very gut level that they do not want this type of subversiveness to spread.
Exactly, which in the case of Jesse James, you end up with Kansas City Marshal and the governor conspiring multiple times over time, actually, to catch them, including their first attempt outside of Joplin, Missouri, with George Shepard as a gunman, and then ultimately, of course, the Ford brothers. So it wasn't, in that situation, it wasn't extremely swift, but in the end, it was pretty brutal.
Yes.
In its retribution. And of course, infamously, Bonnie and Clyde as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, there's also the creation of the cautionary tale of essence. Don't step too far outside the structure.
Exactly. Or this is what will happen. A couple of other examples that come up in lore a lot in the Ozarks region and further south, that a lot of times people will probably assume are completely fictional, and specifically murder ballads would be Staggerly and Railroad Bill. And what people probably don't realize is that those were real men with history and concrete events surrounding them. In fact, Stagger Lee, which of course has been immortalized in various versions of the ballad Stagger Lee, we've discussed previously as one of the more infamous inmates at the old Missouri Penitentiary in St. Louis, over in Jefferson City.
Mm-hmm. But the crime that he ultimately went to state pen for was in St. Louis.
Yes, it was in St. Louis, again, there were attributes of shape-shifting to his story and disguise and so forth that gets focused upon. So it's a situation of real life imitating art, real life sort of imitating the mythological archetype, which is interesting.
It is. It really is.
And then Railroad Bill is very similar to that as well, which Railroad Bill has been immortalized in ballads as well, but the story itself comes more out of the South down towards Alabama, the historical events.
It does. And ultimately Railroad Bill was killed in 1896.
Yes.
And his crimes essentially were in the Alabama and Florida Panhandle region, predominantly against the Louisville and Nashville Railroad.
But a lot of parallels with Jesse James, not only robbing trains, and then more so for James robbing banks, but basically attacking the institutions of the status quo, basically.
Very, very much so. And I think it's there are too many tie-ins for us not to consider Railroad Bill into the larger mythos of essentially the rural American South. And
yes.
The important tie-in is that a portion of the Ozarks borders the Delta South, even in Missouri, and there's an enormous amount of crossover in terms of the Ozarks are part of the upland South.
Yes. Well, and I find it, even aside from that, I just find it interesting the sort of the parallel appeal of this anti-hero, that it's a broader phenomena than just Jesse James and the Ozarks. And it continued after his infamous demise.
It did, and will continue. I think that's a reality, is that these archetypes don't go away, and no amount of authoritarianism, no amount of bureaucracy, no amount of religion, no amount of secularism, no amount of making sure that the entire world has a giant child-proof safety cap is going to change the reality that these archetypes are innate to the human experience.
They really are, and if you look at mythology around the world, the trickster is in virtually all civilizations.
And I think that is important. We're really dealing with the tension between structures, and you could even argue the tension between worlds. And it is a very powerful thing. There was a couple of things with Staggerly and Railroad Bill that jumped out to me in terms of aspects of research that I think are just interesting. One is that Railroad Bill at one point traveled with a circus and learned, is rumored or suggested to have learned the skill as a performer and a showman, in addition to being essentially an athlete. That, to me, that is significant. The circus in this particular case really represents that liminal space, that stepping between worlds. And in this particular instance, it could certainly be theorized that the Railroad Bill, as an African American in the 1870s, 1880s, stepping into that liminal space of the circus, was also stepping into the liminal space where he was was not subservient within this culture.
Right. Well, and it served as a platform to outwit his opponents as well.
And then coming back into the real world, that you could see in this particular case the circus motif, this liminal sort of world between the worlds, then stepping back into the mundane world where suddenly you're a second-class citizen. Suddenly the authorities and the law and the railroads can tell you what to do and tell you, and treat you however they feel like.
Right.
And after having been within this liminal space, and learning the art of showmanship, learning the art of a performer, learning the art of crafting and embodying various characters, various motifs, various archetypes, suddenly say, you know what, I'm not playing by your rules. And essentially breaking, for a short period of time, breaking the spell of being indentured mentally within the structure.
Very true. And from a archetype perspective, that allows him to step into the role of the trickster god, having more power than those around him.
And for a brief period of time, he did.
Yes. And often that is the result. Either the trickster gets away with it wholeheartedly, or is brought down. And in Railroad Bill's situation, he was brought down.
And I think that that we would say, well, that was a good run, your luck ran out, that sort of thing. There is an aspect of the embodiment of a god that suggests that mortals can only carry that mantle for so long before they have to lay it down.
Very true. I like that perspective. And I think a good illustration to just oppose that would be Loki as the god.
Yes. And I mean, thanks to Marvel, Loki is probably he is almost the most well-known trickster god in society. The most well-known trickster god in society is Bugs Bunny.
Yes. Agreed. And now, and something that seems to be a misconception in a lot of the portrayal of Loki is that he is Thor's brother, which he is not.
No, not in the original lore. And but obviously a part of the Asgardians.
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of Loki's antics and saving the world by doing all sorts of terrible things, let's just say if they had actually filmed that, it wouldn't be a PG-13 rated movie.
Very true. Very true.
In some cases, it wouldn't even be an R-rated movie.
Very, very true. So, something's better left to the imagination.
Yes, we'll let you all imagine on that for a moment. Before we leave Railroad Bill and Stagger Lee, there's two other points that really came to mind. One with Stagger Lee is that there was at least a pretty decent implication or rumor that he had spent a lot of time working on the riverboats.
That's true. I'd forgotten about that.
And the aspect of riverboats also existing as a liminal space, showboats existing like the circus, again in those in-between spaces, really brings up the question, are there, and I'm just throwing that out there as a possibility, some similarities in the sense that here again is an individual, an African American living under pretty oppressive circumstances, who may have found a way temporarily to step into a threshold space where those circumstances were no longer in play, and stepping back into quote unquote the real world, and being unwilling to simply unready, unwilling, or very opposed to the idea of stepping back into this space of oppression. And interestingly enough, although I think, modern minds might really struggle with this, that Jesse James, having fought in war, having seen atrocities committed against his family, and then targeting the man, so to speak, the structures, he had already, war had had moved him out of this space.
I think that is a reasonable analogy, and particularly in the case of Confederate bushwhackers or partisan rangers, particularly under Quantrell and Bloody Bill Anderson, who the James brothers rode under. Definitely they stepped outside of normal conventions. Rules did not apply the same way. And more of a sense of determining life and death, analogous to the gods of myth, and to step back into reality. In a lot of cases, it would be a very similar circumstance, particularly when you have to realize that doing so at the end of the Civil War in Missouri as a Confederate, most opportunities were taken away from you. You couldn't practice most vocations, often couldn't hold office, couldn't do a lot of things. And so for a period of 5 or 6 years until another state constitution was passed. So basically it was a situation where they could not function in a normal way.
Yes.
So I think there are some very valid parallels between the three, really.
Mm-hmm. And it reminds me, just as we're talking, it reminds me of another very interesting Missourian associated with St. Louis, not the Ozarks specifically, but certainly St. Louis, which is Josephine Baker.
Very true.
And something that was particularly notable about Josephine, she was a jazz era 1920s, 1930s superstar, in singer and dancer, and provocative dancer as well.
Yes.
Who later went on to have a magnificent, albeit troubled, life in the 1960s and 70s. Was also a hero of the French resistance underground. So
yes, yeah, she lived in Paris for a long time too.
And that was really coming down to my point. Having grown up at the time, turn of the century, St. Louis and East St. Louis as well, and then as an entertainer, having the opportunity to go to France and really make France her homeland during the 20s and 30s, mentally, just in terms of her mental space, she really could not come back to segregated America.
That's correct, because the environment was so much different, and very much more progressive on those issues. that I guess you could really say that expats in Paris in the 20s really did experience their own liminal space.
They did,
Uh,
which I think has been was celebrated through art and literature, and is an epic of a moment within the 20th century and that space. But then just on a nuts and bolts level, just on a real world level, if the thinking about how certain situations like this shift one's patience for a thing, or acceptance of a thing, that had she stayed in St. Louis, she might have been at times appalled or irritated or angry about Jim Crow, but not necessarily as ready to say, I'm not going to put up with this. There's no way that I'm going to live with this. I'm going to go do something else. But having lived in France and having the opportunity, but then also just existing within the space that those laws weren't there, she couldn't come back to that space. And of course, Josephine is a great example of complex individuals that there's no real easy answers. And a number of her forcibly adopted children certainly had interesting views about living with Josephine. So I'm not making her a saint in this regard, but she's a fascinating and beloved figure.
It's kind of interesting as you were talking about Josephine, made me think in some ways it's very, her story kind of illustrates the myth of the Odyssey Trickster, the spider from Ghana in West Africa.
That's a really good point.
Because he was a symbol of resistance for African slaves as the stories came to the New World, and a reminder that something as small as a spider can basically foil the powers that be.
Yes.
And Josephine pretty much did that in her own way.
She did. And I think what is also interesting, and this is a cautionary tale, not Josephine in particular, although she's certainly included in this, but the embracing of the archetypes, the full embracing of the archetypes from a mythopoetic standpoint is touching the divine. It's touching the gods. And as you touch the gods, you become like them. And you're, almost from a Prometheus standpoint, you are literally playing with fire and figuratively playing with fire. And the idea that it's not dissimilar from demonic possession. Can't believe I just said that. I'm going to get into so much trouble with that. I know I am. But it is not dissimilar in the sense that the individuals suddenly find themselves compelled to seemingly erratic behavior. But when you understand the archetype that they're embracing, that behavior actually begins to make sense. And something that's, I think, is a brilliant comparison is Josephine Baker with the Anansi legends.
Well, yes, and I guess I would say the parallel with demonic possession, of course, the difference being free will.
Yes.
And who's in charge at the time. But I don't know, it struck me that when you think about it, her life really does seem to be a good illustration of honesty.
It does. And something from the Ghana archetypal legends, in regards specifically to the Trickster is the idea that the story actually, the stories begin in approximate balance. The world is basically in balance. There might be some issues, but it's basically in balance. And it ends in imbalance. It ends in disharmony. And that to me is fascinating. Of course, that goes against much of our Western civilization storytelling process. Where's the resolve? Well, everything needs to come to a nice, happy ending. And it's, I think, a beautiful way of shaking up our mindset of getting ourselves out of colonialist Western thought, of saying this is how a story has to happen. Anansi, the spider god, is a perfect example of that. And there's a great biography of Josephine Baker. It's massive. It's like 600 pages. I have it and I've read it, and it's really, really good. But something that is striking, and there's the author at the time, there was still a number of first person interviews that he was able to get of individuals who had worked closely with Baker, had interacted with her during the war, after the war, and then also a number of her adopted children who weighed in. And there was some really interesting moments in those interviews, because it was a situation where there was almost a goddess quality about Josephine, but in the sense of very goddess-like, much like Anansi, that you never knew what version of Josephine that you were going to get.
Yes.
And this was an individual that, for example, was willing to risk getting executed for fighting the Nazis. At the same time, made several of her children's lives a living hell after she'd gone to the trouble of adopting them, and would so that just a extraordinary amount of disharmony, and almost from a mundane standpoint, you would say madness, but from an archetypal standpoint, it is the embodiment, and perhaps necessary embodiment, of a god.
True. And one example of sort of the disharmony from the Western world of mythology you actually mentioned earlier would be Prometheus. Because and some might be surprised to view him as a trickster, but he did basically trick the gods, and
on behalf of humanity.
And certainly created disharmony in the world of the gods, and to his own demise, again, one with retribution coming down upon him for it.
Yes. And we see, in the terms of this particular Western mythos, a trickle-down effect of tricksters and trickster gods and trickster demigods, in terms of, for example, Prometheus, and then Atlas, and then Hercules, or Heracles. And just it's interesting, and something that has perhaps been a liability of current or more contemporary Western civilization is that we have left the Greek mythos, and particularly the problematic aspects and the ugliness of the Greek mythos, behind for a much more sanitized versions. And in so doing, we've left ourselves open to being blindsided by this type of manifestation of human behavior.
Well, I mean, maybe we can blame the mouse. I mean, a certain studio that relishes in regurgitating myth and mythos tends to go down that road.
Yeah, very much so, very much so, and I think a certain amount of pulling back from the rigors of classical education as well, in the sense that it wasn't, comparatively speaking, that long ago that many of these myths would have been were actually well read by settlers.
Yes,
and in some cases
the context would have been unstated but known.
Yes. And in some cases, we, and this I think is again almost a trickster juxtaposition, because in many cases, not all certainly, but in many cases, the settlers settling the wild frontiers of places like Ohio, and then Indiana and Kentucky, and then Missouri, and then on westward. Not only were literate, many cases they were reading the Greek classics in Greek.
Yes, I mean, I'm just reminded, even my dad had 4 years of Latin in high school, and I remember one of his favorite books was Caesar's Gallic Wars in Latin.
That's impressive. That's
so yeah. So it's not that long ago that it was a very broad educational experience.
And again, going back to a figure who, in terms of his association with the early West, which of course was Tennessee, and Tennessee's impact, marked impact on the Ozarks, particularly Missouri. Our favorite anti-hero president, Andy Jackson, that again, as I mentioned multiple times on the episodes, you walk into the foyer of the Hermitage, and it is a floor-to-ceiling wallpaper mural of the Epic of Telemachus. And the other aspect of that, which I think is important not to be overlooked, is that a number of the hillbilly Tennessee settlers who called upon Mr. Jackson in his presidency and post-presidency mansion would have been able to have looked at the graphic, almost comic book-like representations of the Epic of Telemachus and recognized exactly what they were seeing.
Exactly. And then another example, circling back around to the James brothers, is that even while they were robbing banks and trains, Frank James carried a volume of Shakespeare, actually carried it through the war as well, and read Shakespeare daily, and was known to quote Shakespeare routinely, which is, again, not something that you think of with someone while they're in the midst of robbing a bank. But
no, you do not. And it also is a vastly overlooked aspect of the reconstituted 1930s through 70s Western frontier myth, because to a modern audience, the idea of sophisticated, highly literate, in case and emphasis, bilingual and trained in the ancient classics, outlaw cowboy
Yes.
is not it's a surreal juxtaposition. It's these things don't go together, and the fact that in many cases those things did go together as part of historical record really speak, first of all, to the what would be the right word, like the washing away of the nuances of reality.
Well, yes, very a simplification of history, and in the people involved.
And another aspect of the trickster motif that I think is incredibly important and oft overlooked is to me, the trickster as a god archetype really bridges the space between the lofty divine and the very earthy reality of humanity.
Yes, it's a duality that our modern sense tends to rebel at synthesizing it.
Mm-hmm.
We want black and white. We want little boxes and things that don't fit in a nice neat little box tend to make the modern mind nervous. And the trickster is anything but that. Whether in myth or these real life characters who basically took on the archetype.
It does. It is the very innate nature of the trickster creates an enormous amount of tension.
Yes.
That also elicits the tension itself. Elicits extremely strong responses. The response can typically be love or hate,
or both.
Yes, or love to hate. It could explain the overall mixed reviews of Moulin Rouge, actually, by Baz Luhrmann, which and we're back to Paris. But something else, just in terms of the earthy nature, that really jumped out to me, and I'm back to Railroad Bill for just a moment, but a Railroad Bill, like Staggerly, inspired multiple songs, multiple folk blues songs that worked their way into beyond public domain and into modern mid-century, mid-20th century music, and then consequently went on to inspire a number of genres, including rock and roll, or just rock. But Will Bennett's 1929 lyrics of Railroad Bill included two lines, one stanza, that really jumped out to me because I went, oh my gracious, I had no idea where that came from, which was, if River was brandy and I was a duck, I'd sink to the bottom and I'd never come up.
Yep.
and between that and Lil Abner, I was suddenly reading all sorts of sayings that managed to make their way into everyday usage in my family. If water in Grandpa's version was whiskey instead of brandy, but still, I grew up with that saying, but I didn't know that it was a song.
Exactly, and that is part of the elegance of this tradition, is that aspects of it do bleed over into everyday life as parables as cautionary tales, or a shorthand for, just conveying a lesson of to be wary of doing this or be wary of the trickster, that has a unconscious resonance and meaning that, just as you said, most people would not put that together, if particularly if you were not versed in that ballad. But it still has the same meaning.
Yes,
in either context.
It functions the same way, and we'll when we get over to Lil Abner, I've got several that come to mind, and that were family specific. One of them involving pumpkins. So, long story. I'll make it short, but it really is. It is powerful, and I think one of the things that I particularly appreciate about the real trickster motif is this bridging of the very human, the very earthy, and also the divine at the same time.
Yes, and I think part of the appeal is that it gives a glimpse of a situation where the average person, the everyman, can sort of touch the divine, whereas so often with organized religion particularly in the last 1,000 years, there's a conduit between the average man and the divine. The sense that to experience the divine, you have to go through the priest, the minister, a building. Whereas this lore is very more reminiscent of older traditions that we all have that connection, that we can make on our own,
and something that a millennia of high church tradition has largely done is stripped away the idea of a sense of humor.
Very true.
and that is innate.
The little thing called the Inquisition just take the fun out of everything.
The Inquisition was such a drag. We shouldn't be laughing right now.
No.
And we're on the, as you noted on your Facebook post this morning, we are on the precipitous anniversary eve of the Salem witch trials.
Yes, they did start 331 years ago today.
If there was ever a group of people who had stripped an earthy sense of humor out of their clannish society at the time, and I think that certainly a aspects of the rise of interest in things like neo-paganism and heathenry really do draw in part from that desire to connect with the earthiness that is also associated with the divine. That
I agree, and I think it's really a universal yearning that so much of organized religion tends to separate people from that. it ends up creating that yearning even in more earnest oftentimes.
And I think it probably also it's important. Full disclaimer for myself, I am an active participant in organized Christian religion, and have been for a long time. I have an enormous amount of respect for it. At the same time, I think that these larger conversations are incredibly important because it is part of the human experience. It is not part of division and labels. It is part of being human.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I was raised in the tradition as well, and I'm not disparaging. I think that by the nature of the institution, it tends to create an unspoken yearning that people want to explore.
It does, and we're often getting tidbits of this this larger world in bits and pieces. We see it, and I think that the current MCU iteration of Loki and his popularity is because of that. Although I would say that Loki in this particular and I love the character. Don't hate. I love the character. I love the character of Thor. But I do think that there's a sanitization that takes place that has pulled back. Let's put it this way: Loki's just a little too clean and a little too pretty to really fit into the trickster motif in a full sense, because there is an earthiness that honestly is much more akin to the hillbilly jester than it is to sort of the enlightened Asgardians of the MCU.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I hadn't thought about that.
It's really just because of the fact that I've watched Thor Ragnarok way too many times. I'm not saying I'm embarrassed about it. I'm not saying I'm proud about it. I'm just saying it is.
It is what it is. Well, maybe on that note, we switch gears a little bit to cryptids.
Yes. It is not as big of a jump as you people are going to think it is.
No, which is the surprising part.
It is a really interesting bit of research, and there's a strong cryptid connection. Both, well, in sort of framing it from three perspectives. One, a northeastern United States cryptid sighting from 1977, and then also a folkloric aspect from Native American lore in southeastern Canada, but then also the trickster motif, as well as the little people motif, which is almost intermingled in terms of the Cherokee.
Yes, and we're talking the cryptid aspect of this. We're talking about the Dover demon, and we are outside the Ozarks here, but Dover, Massachusetts, and it's really fascinating as a sort of a concept because it's an amalgamation. But I've heard of the Dover demon previously. I wasn't as familiar with sort of the older lore concerning the area, which is interesting. But the Dover demon, basically there were sightings in April of 1977. The primary witness was Bill Bartlett, and he was 17 at the time, who observed this creature on what's called Farm Street in Dover, on a stone wall, and there's an outcropping of a rock there that the locals call Polka Rock. And he said that there was a creature on top of the wall that had large red eyes and trindle-like fingers, and that made a very large impression upon him. Two other young people saw similar things in different areas of town. They reported to the police, gave statements, sketches were made, and their sightings were pretty consistent, which is interesting. And from everything I was able to find and dig, there didn't seem to be an indication that they had consulted each other, knew each other, that that any of the accounts were copycat accounts. So, which is interesting. And they're still there, particularly Bartlett still lives in town to this day. And they weren't craving attention. They didn't seem to be craving attention or infamy. They weren't seeking attention with this, which is interesting because it denotes more credibility. Which, it's a creature that in part you say a little bit like Mothman, a little bit maybe like Wendigo, etc. in description, but it doesn't fit any of those things.
It does not. And there's interesting correlations in this. Now, at the time, police told the Associated Press that they believed that it was, quote, probably nothing more than a school vacation hoax. But what is, to me, really, really powerful, this took place in 1977. In 2006, we have a newspaper article revisiting it. And 29 years later, William Bartlett is still standing behind his story. He's not recanting it, but he's also not profiting from it or benefiting from it in any way. And even at one point, largely says, in this case, I didn't make it up. Sometimes I wish I had.
Yeah. Another point, he says, it's a thing that's been following me for years, not the creature, the story.
Yes.
And sometimes I dread every Halloween getting calls about it. So,
right.
Almost one of his own nightmare. But it is very very interesting. Now, there was another incident a year later, where something with teenage couple parked, and something banging on the car, that they liken it to almost a modern day Sleepy Hollow encounter. But in the same area. But then it gets more interesting that if you go back to 1914, a book by Frank Smith called Dover Farms writes of Farm Street, that in early times, this road went around by the picturesque Polka Rock, which was called for a man by that name, of whom it is remembered. And amid the superstitions of the age, he thought he saw his satanic majesty as he was riding on horseback by the secluded spot. So we have a devil or demon on a horseback. And then also it's noted that the same spot has legends of a hidden treasure, but no one has been able to find it or ascertain why there would be treasure there, that it's far enough away from the sea, etc. It wouldn't be pirates, etc. So and then there's the supposition or theory that the Polka Rock was actually named the Puka Rock, and over time became known as Polka instead, which makes this even more interesting.
It does. It does. There's a couple of aspects of this that I think are worth digging into. One, if Polka Rock is actually Puka Rock, Pukas are an Irish fae, generally associated with the Sealy court. Thank you, W.B. Yeats. That are a mischievous fae, and typically not a deadly fae, although they certainly could do that if they wanted to. But they are highly mischievous. We don't know what a puka actually looks like. We do know that it manifests itself as a dog or a large rabbit or horse, or sometimes a person. Mm-hmm. And the aspects of manifesting as a person or as a horse in particular makes one draw some comparisons with the Scottish Kelpie, but the Kelpie kills people and then eats them. Mm-hmm. The puka typically just plays pranks.
Right. But again, it's a shapeshifter.
Yes.
And so, a form of a trickster.
Mm-hmm. And to a certain degree, we can almost say if something is existing as a shapeshifter, there is a strong trickster aspect to it, regardless.
Very true. Very true.
And interestingly enough, that could be shifters, for one. It could be any one of these aspects of fae or folkloric beings or creatures, fairies, or it literally could be an outlaw putting on a disguise.
Exactly. Then there's the Canadian tie into this.
Yes, and the biggest tie is the recognition that what was seen in Dover, Massachusetts in 1977 strongly resembles a being out of Cree folklore.
Yes. The Manigashi.
Yeah, and the Manigashi is in some cases described simply as a trickster cryptid. There's a great overview on the YouTube channel William DeFalco, who covers a lot of cryptids. Mm-hmm. And there's key elements. You take the Dover demon, and this is what the original connection was made for us, but you take the Dover demon and the Manigashi from Cree lore, and you have a small human-like being with gray skin, really large eyes, extremely slender arms and legs, 6 long fingers, tendril-like fingers, and then no mouth and no nose.
Yes.
That's creepy.
That is creepy. It also reminds me a bit of Pale Walker accounts.
It does.
Which there are accounts of Pale Walkers in the Ozarks.
Yes, there are. Some very close to home.
Some very close to home.
Yes. Very close to home. And what is to me really fascinating now, the Cree, and it's important to note, we're talking about the ancestral lands of the Cree, which is largely southeastern Canada, on the northern banks, or the northern edges, the north side of the Great Lakes.
Yeah.
Important in terms of just a cursory overview. We're not talking about the Creek Indians. We're talking about the Cree Indians.
Right.
Important distinction, because the Creeks are in southeast United States. Now, the Cree lore associates these almost as water nymphs or water sprites, consistently associated with water. Now, there are some accounts that go into an interesting physiological hypotheses that they breathe amphibian-like through their skin, through the water, etc. And so they just like the water because that's where they breathe, and that explains why they don't have a nose. We still haven't explained why they don't have a mouth. I'm afraid I'm learning how they actually eat, or what they eat, or if they eat.
Osmosis.
Yeah. They just absorb you in your sleep. So, well, just ponder that as you lay in bed tonight. But there is, I think, oftentimes when we're dealing with this type of cryptid, it is a mistake to try to make it fit into our natural world in the same way that an animal. We're not really talking about taxonomy here, a physiological taxonomy. We're talking about something that, and I don't think that I'm too far off base on, that may be more akin to phenomena surrounding a conjuring space.
I think that's potentially accurate there. Yeah, it's. I don't think there's any real assumption that it's a animal per se. The one possible explanation that was given by some authorities at the time was, well, might have been a yearly moose.
Yes.
But it didn't make sense for the time of year and the size of what was seen. And that likely even a young moose at that time of the year would have been the size of a car and probably not mistaken.
and most likely not climbing over the side of the wall using its long tendril-like fingertips.
Bipedally at that.
Right. There's the aspect that is there's an interesting tie-in terms of Trickster with the Managishi, because the Cree lore about the Managishi is that it plays tricks. It's highly intelligent. It plays tricks.
Mm-hmm.
The lore does not seem to say that it is dangerous, that it's going to throttle you in your sleep like Gollum, but it is does weird things, unsettling things. It throws rocks. It makes strange noises. Apparently, there is also a fur-bearing version, and
If that's not, if one isn't creepy enough, then.
And I think the fact that that it's reasonable to conjecture that the Managishi come and go through a conjuring space.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's also associated with caves as well.
Yes, which have a strong association with inner space, or not inner space, but a concept that in the Ozarks, certainly from a folkloric perspective, has been at times referred to as the below ground, meaning the underworld. Again, strong association with Welsh lore, the other world, the kingdom of the other world. And there is, for some of us, particularly with Celtic, and I think in some cases Native American ancestry, the idea of slipping between worlds is not that difficult to conceptualize.
No, I don't think so. And that's often the motif of the trickster is often exemplified in that sense by things like the coyote that slip between spaces unseen.
Yes.
And here in the Ozarks, there are instances of phantom coyote experiences that would be almost a literal experience of that liminal space.
And I believe it is. And the other thing, so is sort of triangulating the lore of the Managishi to the situation at Dover, which has, the particular area at Dover where this Managishi like being appeared to have manifested. That is also a space of unique conjuring aspects. To I'm gonna, the next point on the triangle for me is Devil's Promenade and Brooklight Road, which again the idea that certain spaces which may be associated with very ancient conjurings, the idea that a ritual conjuring may have taken place, or may have taken, number of them may have taken place, certainly by an earlier people, and that the resonance of that continues.
Right. And some people may be unfamiliar with what we're referring to there for the Devil's Promenade area, which will be, if you read the book that we have coming out next month, or at the end of the month, because it is March now. There's more on that there, that it's something that's not widely publicized in literature so far, but theory that we certainly are exploring and investigating as far as the conjuring.
It is, and it's a concept that I think has a weight. Of course, there's many of these things, there's simply so much we don't know. But just as when we come back to the paranormal realities, the realities are, do we understand what a paranormal phenomenon is fully? No, we don't. We conjecture. Do we understand that phenomena occurs? Absolutely.
Yes.
And in the case of these, what we're referring to as ancient conjuring spaces or ancient conjuring sites, it is the conjecture that something was ritualistically done over a long period of time, or a long time ago, that has essentially opened something up. Not necessarily something bad, but certainly opened something. And as a result of that, there is a wide variety of phenomena that would otherwise seem inexplicable to all be taking place in the same location or same immediate region.
Yes. Well put.
I also wanted to throw in the fact that I think that the Managishi move in and out of space. And consequently, I have two thoughts on that. One, because we're dealing with something that is physical, but is physical only as it chooses to be, in essence, or physical within our dimension or realm only as it feels like, and then it moves back to wherever it came from, at will. And it's very realistic that water and or caves are the portal. In some cases, the portal might be naturally occurring. In other cases, the portal might have been created by a conjuring. We theorized similar things in regards to, I believe, the Dogman, some of the Dogman lore.
Yeah, a lot of the lore of the Dogman seems to parallel that.
Now, there's a couple, and this is because it's late and it's March 1st, I suppose. And it's just my brain, which, brings up the fact that the right kind of conjuring at the right place might open up an inadvertent portal, and it might accidentally poop out a unsuspecting Managishi who suddenly look around going, where the hell am I? That's what.
How did I get here?
Yeah, where did I come from? In regards to the fur-bearing Managishi, the fact that they clearly can come and go is the fact that they can come and go as they will, and consequently are extremely elusive, is a good thing. Otherwise, they would have been likely exterminated by the East India Trading Company and turned into a bunch of fur hats in London about 1690.
Well, thankfully that didn't happen.
Yes. I'm contemplating save Managishi bumper sticker.
T-shirt might work better.
I'm good. I am good with that as a t-shirt. Save your local Managishi.
Have to make note.
Oh, I have paper.
Coming soon to the website. I guess we should know, we've touched a little bit on native lore, including Managishi, and the predominant tribe in the Ozarks before relocation, of course, was the Osage. And the Osage do have a trickster god, the Yitski, but ironically, it's not very prominent compared to other tribes. And specifically, he's not a coyote. He's not represented as Coyote. But I do find it kind of interesting that the Osage didn't focus as much on trickster legends as some other tribes in the region.
It really is, because in so many cases the trickster figure is such a dominant figure. Raven in the northwest, rabbit in the southeast, coyote in the southwest, and again we're looking at a really interesting confluence of ideas. These are animals and birds that, if you're familiar with them, you understand they're highly intelligent, they're very clever, they do play tricks, just by nature. And if you're out watching, and same could be said for foxes, but you watch and coyotes will screw with you if you get as you're in that process. And so you can say that just from a purely clinical or mundane view, Human beings watch the animals, decide to draw lessons from the animals. That's a pretty basic childhood storybook approach to how stories begin. I think that it overlooks the fact that there are very magical or otherworldly or archetypal lessons to be learned from the natural world. That it's not, and we have a very insulated and privileged view where we can look at the natural world often from sort of this snooty place on high, because our lives are not currently dependent upon the vagaries and the violence and the uncertainty of nature.
Fair point.
However, wouldn't take much crumbling of civilization to put us right back there. So snootiness is a perhaps undeserved privilege.
If anyone questions that, just drop yourself in the middle of the savannah and see how how nature encroaches in the form of lions, rhinoceros, etc., hippos.
Yes. You know, this is, and that's one. And although I don't want to be stalked by an apex predator, I think it's one of the reasons that we are fascinated by the concept, because we really take this very high up position that we're at the top of the food chain.
Yeah.
And once in a while we're not. And sometimes, and as we've noted, in most cases with paranormal interaction, it's not a pecking order. There's simply reasonably fair interaction between paranormal and physical, ghosts and people, things and people. Not a lot of freak out moments, just they're kind of doing their thing, we're kind of doing ours. Sometimes our paths intersect. But once in a while in the spiritual realm as well, there is an apex predator. And these are conscious elements that are really there, I think, as cautionary tales and reminders to remember our real place and sometimes stay in our lane.
That's a valuable lesson.
And it doesn't do any good to freak the hell out, but it is a reminder at times to tread lightly
In respect.
It's surprising. First of all, I think it's just surprising how much in interaction with life, as well as the things outside of life, sort of, that simply having respect will get you so much further.
Yes, that is definitely my experience. Now then, we can switch gears a little bit, come back to the Ozarks directly.
Yes.
In our sort of our own mythological trickster that people might not think of.
Yes.
Lil Abner.
And schmooze.
Yes.
Oh, I love this, and I did not actually grow up reading Lil Abner.
I did not either, really. Although when I was very, very young, did go to Dog Patch once or twice.
And I wanted to go to Dog Patch. I missed that. I've driven by its remains, which made me a bit sad down there in Arkansas.
It is, and and the fate of the park, for those that are wondering, Lil Abner was a comic strip.
Yes.
And mainly I think from the 40s through the 70s, if I remember right.
Mhm. Yeah, 1934 to 1977.
Okay. And then ultimately, Dogpatch USA was a theme park based
Mhm.
around the characters in Lil Abner. It has, after it closed, there's been several attempts to resurrect it
Mhm.
and get it going again in one fashion or another that just seem to kind of fall apart.
Yeah, in every and I'm not gonna tell tales because I'd have to actually look at the documentation. I think current ownership is actually moving it towards something consistent that may actually happen. But every
I've heard
so
that too.
often, what's that?
I've heard that too, that there's a little more promise of something happening with it now.
Yeah, but certainly it was beloved. Just as a bit of an aside, what I never got to go. What was it like?
Um, it was in some ways a bit like Silver Dollar City, but not. It had more of a campy feel to it,
Mhm.
more of a lighthearted feel to it. To me, and of course, I was fairly young, but it didn't seem like it took itself as serious as Silver Dollar City does. um, it was just kind of fun. It was almost that stepping out of yourself, out of your element, and seeing this, I don't want to say simplistic, but just this idealized version of the idea of the hillbilly.
Yes, which again, I think really tying into our episode last week and our aspects of hillbilly jester, that these are very important dynamics. These are important uh, cultural icons
Mm-hmm.
of American history, and these are. I would say regional archetypes, not mythological archetypes, but regional archetypes that we overlook culturally at our own peril.
Yes. And um, some people may be saying, okay, what does this have to do with tricksters? But Lil Abner employed the main elements of the trickster archetype in his adventures, through the comic strip and different media that was produced. He was clever, and but he was still a little rough around the edges.
He was
But
by nature the trickster, and I think that this really, again, to serve as a counterpoint to the MCU trickster of Loki. This
mm-hmm.
is a trickster that goes unnoticed as a trickster, but fulfills the roles. If he fulfills the aspects, and some of them very literally, in the ones of being comparatively small of stature, easy to overlook, but also not unattractive. Almost consistently, and this is based on mythological archetypes. So go throw something at Joseph Campbell, not me, if you don't like it. But that the trickster is almost exclusively male in
Mhm.
ancient archetype stories.
Yeah. It just, that is just the way that the archetype developed. And I think in part, rightly or wrongly, that happened because of the methods that the trickster uses would traditionally be seen as something that a lady would not associate herself with.
Very true. And there is, I suppose, subversive within hunter or subversive within masculine role
Mm-hmm.
Job to this position. And I can't help but drawing comparison between cartoons, the comic strip of Lil Abner, but to my favorite cartoon, which is Bugs Bunny, is drawing those comparisons. Bugs Bunny is clever. He always has some aspect of the upper hand. He has a near omniscient view of his enemy. He is at the same time very everyday, very earthy. He makes comparatively inappropriate jokes, especially for the era.
Yes. Well, and dressing in drag, for instance.
I was gonna say, and classically dressing as a woman to do things, and to foil the enemy. But also there's the aspect with Bugs Bunny that you always feel that he has one eye on the audience, and a good half of what he's doing is to make us laugh.
Yes. Yes. And actually, another example in the Looney Tunes world of the trickster really would be the Roadrunner.
Yes.
Which exemplifies the animal motif that often comes out with the trickster characters. But the Roadrunner fools Wile E. Coyote, which again is a play because
yes,
the coyote is the trickster,
yes,
but he's being tricked.
And is something that is an interesting observation. It could be conjectured that Wile E. Coyote, super genius, is the fact that he is that he should be the trickster.
Mm-hmm.
He should be the embodiment of the trickster, but you could conjecture that his embracing of modernity, his obsession with Acme, the idea that he has printed business cards. Can you tell I'm a fan? Printed business cards, that he's constantly ordering things from companies to accomplish his goal. The fact that he has, rather than embraced his archetypal God divinity through intuition and through the effects of the subconscious, he has instead given himself completely over to the rational conscious mind. Yes. Again, the fact that he keeps introducing himself and approaching things as some sort of benign quasi scientist, door-to-door salesman is, I would speculate, a reminder that as we embrace modernity, we lose that spark of divinity, that the primitive, quote unquote, that is actually the sophisticated. And Roadrunner, who isn't even doesn't even speak, he just beeps, right. Has fully embraced this drive away from modernity, this animalistic intelligence. We tend to associate, I think, because of our snootiness, that we're that animals aren't intelligent, that animals are animalistic in nature. We even have verbiage for that.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, if you are familiar with how the natural world works, if you're familiar with the rhythms of this larger energy, we realize that there is an enormous amount, an unfathomable amount of intelligence that is at play, of cunning and survival and intuition, which is a deeper intelligence than conscious thought. And I think that there's something very enduring about this, and something as simple as a children's cartoon and Wile E. Coyote putting on his rocket skates.
Well, and switching it back around to Lil Abner, it's the same process. It's the cartoon, but it's a way to analyze and critique the quote sophisticated urban culture that is supposed to be quote in charge of the world.
Yes, ostensibly in charge.
Yes. And in particular, it's a representation of mountain culture in the South. And but almost in the view of that this culture was created almost as myth, more than reality.
Right. And it is a situation in which Cap, who created this, Kaplan was not from the Ozarks. He was a Northeasterner.
But New York, I believe, yeah.
It's very powerful in terms that if you know where to look, you can find hillbillies almost anywhere.
Oh, very true. Very true.
And
all parts of the country have hillbillies if you look.
Yes, and in other countries and other cultures as well, there's so much that encapsulates in terms of hillbilly culture. But reviewing Lil Abner, reviewing the dialects, which technically are fictitious, reviewing the figures of speech, reviewing the bits and pieces of characters, the fact that I grew up with references to schmooze and Kickapoo Joy Juice that I really didn't even know where it came from, but I grew up with these. There was another one that was in Lil Abner that I recognized because my family used the terminology. And just in terms of utilization of words and how it can move into pop culture and become something other than what it was necessarily intended. One year in 2006, 2007, actually the year that I started State of the Ozarks, my mom had procured a package of white Kusha pumpkins. Told you there was going to be a pumpkin story. White Kusha pumpkins from Baker Creek Seeds in Mansfield, Missouri, heirloom seeds. Yeah. We planted them. They grew prolifically. And it was really interesting just in terms because the white Kusha pumpkin grows almost gourd-like. It has a round bulbous bottom and it turns into like a big, looks like a big goose sort of thing. It's very rounded. And these things start growing and they don't stop. And we're watching these things. And at one point, my mom goes, "It's a shmoo." And I'm like, "That's nice. What is a shmoo?" And she's like, "Here, look it up." And I look at it and I look at the shape and the color of a shmoo. And I'm going, "Oh my gosh, it is a shmoo." And then on top of that, shmoos are delicious. And the Kusha melons, you can kind of make it into anything. We ended up making them into pie. And so somewhere on State of the Ozarks is a photo of a shmoo.
Well, there you go. Al Cap would be proud.
I hope so. I hope so. It was a good moment, and the pie was excellent.
Pie sounds good.
It does sound good. Pie always sounds good. Some of the best pie in the world can be found in the Ozarks.
That's very true. um, and talking about, the mountain motifs and everything, we could go into Jack the Hero.
I really found the Jack the Hero concept to be really fascinating, especially with its ties to the Ozarks. And in this particular reference, the trustedbell.wordpress.com site, excellent site, really, really good information on that. I loved the Trusted Bell WordPress site's work, and there's also a great reference to the work of Judy and Richard Dockery Young and their books, which I don't believe are in print anymore, but you can get them at times as used books, are well worth your time.
Yeah,
What really
I've got several of them. Yeah.
I do too. And fantastic stuff. My introduction to Ozarks folklore was through Richard and Judy Dockery Young.
Very neat.
That what really jumped out to you about this particular lore?
Well, for one thing, I like the fact that he's, a bit of an underdog. And it is something that is fairly tied to the Ozarks and the Appalachia. So it's more regional. But he's the underdog who has to face trials. I mean, to be honest, it kind of goes back to Heracles, same type of sort of challenges. But I really like the old fire dragoman story.
Yes.
And Jack and the old tush.
I'm personally glad that Jack did not encounter a howler.
We'll get to that later.
I'm just glad Jack didn't. And for just a little bit of contextualization, Jack is a archetypal hero of European origin.
Yeah.
And we predominantly know him as Jack and the Beanstalk.
Yes.
But the idea that Jack is a character who's gone to do many adventures, gone to do many things, gone about a variety of things. And so the Beanstalk adventure was just one of many.
Right. And he is a bit of a combination of sort of that the hero per se. Mm-hmm. Also, it's the sacred son tradition that he's sort of destined to be a hero, but Jack is also a trickster, which of course Jack and the Beanstalk, he tricks the giant.
Yes.
So you combine the trickster with the more pure hero aspect that you don't see combined as often. But Jack kind of bridges those two, and usually it always comes out good and kind of with a wink see what we did here aspect to the story. But the old fire dragoman tale, which, and it's sort of like the Jack and the Wishing Rings, a classic story. It's about theft, stealing from a giant or a goddess, usually in these stories. But the Ozark tale is Jack and the old Tush, and Tush meant tusk in old Ozark dialect.
Yes.
And so a monster is stealing Jack and his brother's food, which is a little different than Jack and the Beanstalk, where they were just, they were starving and sell the cow to get money to support the family. But so there's trials, there's tribulations of figuring out who is stealing the food, and it's usually a giant or some monster. In this case, old Tush, who's sent by a Willy-Wah, which is an Ozarkian leprechaun-like creature. A while back, you were saying you wanted a leprechaun Ozark story, so there you have it.
I am very happy about the Willy-Wah.
So basically, and it also usually involves the below ground, the caves. So instead of a beanstalk that goes up into the clouds, it takes place in the caves in the underworld, basically. But it's Jack basically saving the day, but with a little bit of trickery as a means.
And something that I find very interesting about Jack as the trickster motif here in the Ozarks, as well as elsewhere, is that in Jack's trickster qualities seem to come from three aspects. One, he is a poor everyman. He represents us. And so he doesn't have resources. He does not have the magical, overarching, all powerful resources of a traditional god figure. And so, or the mythological god figures. And so he has to employ trickery in order to get things done.
Right.
And that's one of the things that makes him so endearing, because we can place ourselves into his story. If we were in this situation, we couldn't call upon, the strength of Thor, so to speak, or any of its equivalents. We'd have to figure out a way to trick these other beings into doing what we wanted them to do. That said, as noted within this WordPress article on the site, there is a psychopomp aspect, because he does seem to be able to magically travel between realms.
That's true. And even Jack and the Beanstalk, in essence, he does.
It is something that we really overlook, because again, I think that we tend to we tend to be mentally trained. Coming back to the importance of trickster archetypes is to move our heads out of the space that we're in. Mm-hmm. Just like, for example, Josephine Baker moving out of Jim Crow laws and moving to France, not ever really being able to fit back into that old world, and probably for the better. That these liminal spaces, entering into the liminal space, even conceptually, means that we really can't go back. We can't go back to the old way of thinking. And Jack, in this particular case, is in really challenging us in these moving into other realms. But our almost monolithic modern simplicity doesn't see climbing the beanstalk as moving into another realm. and having to change the way we think and see the world and change our perspective, we see it just as a literal beanstalk. And we're like, oh, look, he climbed up it and then he climbed down it. And we're really not allowing ourselves the boon, to quote Joseph Campbell, the idea that the hero journeys and take and is able to retrieve a boon, something of great worth to bring back to the people that somehow helps them. It feeds them. It changes their mindset. It changes their perspective. It brings abundance. It ushers in, it brings the rain. It does something good to more people. And then we're like, oh, look, there was a beanstalk and now he's at the bottom of it again. And we're not being changed by this story.
Right. And again, that's that modern perspective.
Which I think part of that is the idea that we relegate these stories as children's stories. And so we think of them as pure entertainment,
Mm-hmm.
rather than a larger mythopoetic saga that is meant to teach us as adults something.
Very true. Now, one aspect I do find interesting about the Old Tush tale is that, now, Tush means tusk, and the supposition that Old Tush is the Gowrow.
Yes. And that really, again, forcing me to get outside. I love Gowrow stories, but it forces me to get outside of the literal and dismissive, and suddenly the Gowrow moves into a pantheon of beings that have a lot more weight. But this is something that also is uniquely Ozarkian.
It is. And the Willywaw in the story is sometimes characterized as a one-eyed magical blacksmith, which the author in the research article points to Odin, but which is possible. It would not be my first assumption, though, because blacksmiths from the time of the ancient Greeks have been depicted as one-eyed. And the reason being is literally they would put a patch over one eye so that if sparks from the fire and the anvil hit them in the face, that they would only be blinded in one eye, they'd still have eyesight. So, I mean, there is some conjecture that the concept of the Cyclops actually refers to blacksmith, because in myth, the Cyclops were blacksmiths for the gods.
That is interesting.
So, I think Odin is, I think Odin is sort of that Northern European idea, but literally it would just be a reference to being a blacksmith. And to me, that makes more sense, because in the tale, in the caves in the underground, Jack has to defeat giants. And he's only able to do so with rusty farm tools, which again points to him as the everyman fighting the gods, basically. But that again would reinforce the idea of the iron and the blacksmith to me.
It does. And iron, for me, is tying into a lot of interesting things. Gods of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that iron traditionally was a way to repel not only bad luck, but potentially the fae.
fae or other evil, and specifically in folk magic, rusted items were used for curses and hexes. So, um, so it could point to between the blacksmith reference and that his weapons were rusty farm tools, that perhaps these giants had to be killed by a curse or a hex of some sort, resorting to magic, which again transcends that connection with the divine and the trickster. So
it does. And I can't help but think a little bit about not only Hephaestus, but also Goban, the Celtic god of blacksmithing.
true.
The,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that blacksmithing was in for ancient Celts revered as a magical art.
Very true. I think that the foe is our giants, of course, provides some continuity with the old European versions of Jack. But it's also kind of interesting because there are a number of stories of giants in the region, some being remains found, skeletons found, others in native lore. And so it's almost a possibility of acknowledgement of the old world aspect of the story, as well as perhaps things found and heard as they came into the region.
Yes, and something that is, I believe, often overlooked during the colonial and early settlement periods of the United States is the enormous amount of cultural flux and cultural intermixing that was going on, and the fact that these are significant and ancient cultures that are fusing together in the early formation of the United States.
Yes, I agree with you there.
Now, realistically, based on time, I think we've arrived with the Trickster Howler as our conclusion for tonight's episode.
I think so. And in some aspects, it's not any more far-fetched than the Howler itself.
True. From a modern myth-making standpoint, the Ozark Howler might as well be a trickster.
Well, he's tricked Hollywood.
Yes, and spawned his own website. So I'd say that the Ozark Howler, from that perspective, from a modern cultural perspective, is indeed a trickster.
I would, it really in the vein of Bugs Bunny, etc. Using communication in a clever way to further his ends.
Yes. And in this particular reference, found at ozarkhowler.info, there is the conjecture that the Ozark Howler is actually a human-bear hybrid created through magic by Aleister Crowley.
Certainly, certainly attention grabbing when you see the headline. Um, it, he's a trickster, but I don't think he's quite that much of a trickster. But I do like the fact that they try to put this in terms of the Ghostbusters movie.
Yes, yes. Yeah, the title of the post is Aleister Crowley, the father of the Ozark Howler, and then we get Ghostbuster references and the idea that somehow an English black magician traveled to the Ozarks and did the you know what with something, and a baby howler was born.
And but with the conclusion that in folk mythology, detailed factual matters are beside the point.
True, and I would for the fun of it, I agree. From an archetypal standpoint, and this is I'm going now. I'm going to be the snooty one. I would say that the details are the point. I think that something that it can be consistently frustrating about a modern view of folklore is the idea that it's just made up stories. We can just make up anything. And looking even just a cursory dive into Trickster lore from tonight shows that Tricksters and the Trickster lore, not only is it thousands of years old, it is also consistent throughout many cultures for thousands of years. And it really speaks to the fact that folklore is more than just something you feel like making up. That we're dealing with elemental truth. We're dealing with archetypal truth that speaks to the human experience. And if we're humble enough to listen, that we can gain an enormous amount of wisdom, an enormous amount of knowledge, a repository of wealth that is intuitional wealth, that steps beyond intellectual understanding and moves into the intuition, which is extraordinarily powerful. It speaks to us holistically as human beings. It speaks holistically into the human experience. And it is encapsulated in just a few short paragraphs of stories, but there's extraordinary wealth there. However, it is technically specific, it is intuitionally specific. And in our modern era, we've oftentimes mistaken that for, oh, you can just make up anything. And I think we tread that path at our own peril.
I think so, and just the fact that these modern tales that continue to build, such as Ozark Howler, just is evidence of the innate human need to wrestle with and grasp this concept. And of course, literally, does the Howler fit the Trickster archetype? Not literally. Although the way it has morphed and changed over the last 20 years in itself is a good illustration of a trickster at work.
It is. And I might go so far to conjecture that the trickster spirit, which could be archetypal, it could be sentient, could be alive and well in employing its wiles against an unsuspecting group of people who are intent upon employing the motif.
In such case, it's been pretty successful.
It has. My hat's off to the real Howler.
Wherever he is,
wherever he is, whatever he's doing right now, I drink a toast to the real Howler.
Same. And on that note, perhaps we'll conclude, but we don't want you to forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping to bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
On the next episode, we're going to be discussing Celtic lore and the Ozarks. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, or about any other podcast platform. Thank you, everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.